Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Kathleen Doltmeyer, and I am the International Division Marketing Representative. Our regular MC, Jeff Willis, had a scheduling conflict, so he asked me to substitute. Today, we are hosting environmental, social, and governance issues and what it means for compliance, presented by Lisa Brunel. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your Teams control panel, and I will bring them up during the Q&A session after Lisa's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Internet Division's website later today. So, okay, on to the presentation. Today's presenter is an International Division favorite, Lisa Brunel. For more than 30 years, Lisa has been working in compliance and international trade for various industries worldwide. She is recognized for her knowledge and experience in risk management, investigative reporting, and development of policy implementation to comply with laws and regulations. Lisa has worked with international businesses developing policies that comply with organizational regulatory requirements, and she has worked with a multitude of organizations, both large and small. Lisa is a popular speaker for the International Division. Last year, she co-hosted 2 webinars about supply chain disruption and most recently hosted a webinar about the conflict in the Ukraine. So Lisa, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I am very grateful. Thank you, Kat, for being here. I was at a conference, the ICPA, International Compliance Practitioners Association, this past spring, and one of the topics was on ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. And I thought it was very interesting how the perspective was especially in trade compliance and trying to get a seat in the boardroom, and lawyers' perspective of how they're trying to engage and get involved with. Many businesses struggle with compliance being a part of the business, part of the everyday thought and the processes. And so they had brought in ESG, and I thought that it was really interesting how they had brought that in from the perception of compliance and how the two. So I'm sharing with you information that I learned. I thought that it was very informative, and I hope that you do as well. And basically just wanted to share some of that with you. So on the next slide is just kind of the header slide there. There we go. And next slide. Awesome. So ESG, right? What is it? Environmental, social, and governance. It's not the first time we've heard it. It's not the first time we've seen it. Many different things have arose. Environmental looks at the impact of resources, consumption of any business on the environment, like carbon footprint, wastewater discharge, right? And then you have social, where they're actually looking at how a business interacts with communities and where that it actually operates within their local region. And then governance, right? You would think regulatory law, but G being governance really is relating to internal practices and policies that lead to your decisions making and legal compliance, right? So it's really more about your internal controls, your investor relations. It is about stakeholder management, understanding what are your rules, laws, and regulatory requirements, right? So we all understand whistleblowers, we all understand harassment, discrimination, bribery cases, and not a lot of companies actually see that together as a foothold within all of compliance. So compliance is not just about international trade. Compliance is product compliance. You have certain products that you have to give disclosure to about chemical resistance. You have restrictions under the Clean Air Act. You have EPA restrictions about whether a product can actually be brought into a country, even sold within a certain state. And then you also have the code of conduct side of the business, right? And is it ethical? And Russia is a great example of where the ethical side of the business is really what was the driving factor for where we are today with the situations that are going on. So next slide. So many of you also heard of corporate social responsibility, right? That's a big part of ESG. And that really is what investors look at The investors who are looking at companies are really looking at the non-financial metrics, right? To evaluate the potential for their investments. In corporate social responsibility, it is voluntary, but it is huge when investors are making decisions. It's huge when political, ethical, when companies look at businesses, when they're buying your brand, when they're buying your product. If your name is out there from a liability, so think of Enron, think of Wells Fargo and those incidences that happen from them, from oil spills or fraud and corruption that was going on from bribery schemes. Those are great examples of the ESG environment that had a significant impact based on who they were across the world, right? Across somebody's perception of who they were. So next slide, where we talk about, so why do companies really focus on it, right? So a great example is most recently that we can all relate to is the Russia-Ukraine crisis, right? Where there is a huge increase on the social and political pressures of activists and investors. But think of BP and your big oil companies. They were the very first, from an ethical perspective, to pull out of their contracts in Russia, because they said they just made a stance. They said, this is wrong, we don't agree with it, and we're pulling out. And so many companies there soon after followed suit from a ethical perspective, from a social perspective, that no, we do not agree with what it is that you're trying to do. So it has a big impact on businesses, right? So environmental catastrophes. Years past, the Black Blizzard in the 1930s had released harmful dust particles, killing hundreds of people. We all know about the BP oil spill in the Gulf, right? That was years ago, but it was $10 billion cleanup and legal costs. You have the Kuwaiti fires in 1991 that had an estimated of 1.5 million barrels actually of oil that was spilled, killing people. And so there's corporate fraud, right? There's Enron, there's GE, there's Tyco, there's WorldCom. And so all of these play a role in your brand, your reputation, who you are, your social requirements, forced labor. Just last month, we went in the Uyghur, and I probably said that wrong. And that is a perspective of the forced labor requirements in China, that we cannot do business with companies who are sourcing raw material from forced labor, right? And so on the next slide, where you see in this example is the women and children who fled Ukraine, and the rail yards, the railways trade unions in Ukraine had developed a warning message for passengers, because the war in Ukraine, the invasion, ignited massive populations and movement across the border. And so these women were without work. And so they were trying to find anything so that they could provide for their family. Well, that of course created this human trafficking and forced labor from people who were sitting at the border waiting to take advantage of these families, these situations, in inhumane situations, right? And so you also have on the next slide where we talk about risk in the supply chain. There's huge complex supply chains today face high risk in ES&G for non-compliance from a workforce. Are they working in a healthy environment, in a safe environment? Again, we talked about forced labor, corruption, bribery. There's many countries that don't consider bribery as, they just consider it a part of doing business, but it is an illegal activity, right? Terrorism, finance, money laundering, counterfeiting, all of these fall within the scope of supply chain with ES&G. So it does have an impact to compliance, because compliance needs to be looking at this across the business, right? There isn't any one department that compliance is not involved or should be actually involved. So on the next slide, We talk about the new legal requirements. I don't know if you all are familiar under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That actually became effective on June 21st. And so this is a specific region within China that is known for, in the manufacturing facilities, for using forced labor, slave labor, illegal prison labor, in which to produce commodities and products. And so this actually came about under the Trade Facilitation and Enforcement Act. And we all know that forced labor has been around for many, many years, but it's never been enforced. We've never had the ability, there was some loopholes in the law. And so it was until recently in which that they were able to get visibility and access into China and the traceability of where raw materials and products are actually being sourced from. And so Customs has actually already issued an enforcement guide that talks about how companies can actually identify and have processes to verify whether your product is sourced from forced labor, right? So many other countries as well are getting on board with this. On the next slide, we see the global enforcement efforts. Most recently is Germany under their human rights due diligence law. We have the Australian Modern Slavery Act. Even California, here in the United States, has the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. UK Modern Slavery, all of these are starting to come together in a coalition in which that we are trying to fight against and understand and identify who are we buying products from. It's a due diligence requirement. It's a pushing down those requirements of not just buying from anyone and everyone, but know who you're sourcing products from, right? And so now on the next slide, where we want is greenwashing, right? So greenwashing is when brands, corporations, organizations, or governments co-opt sustainability narratives, right, to portray environmentally responsible image without any type of sufficient responsible action, right? So in other words, you are making a statement, you're making a claim, and you're trying to be very meaningful in what that claim is, but you have nothing to back it up. You have no verifiable data, no facts. That is the worst thing that you can do. Make sure that whenever you are making a statement, you are making a claim, that you can communicate that in a way that is truthful and has verifiable data. Because this is where agencies and regulatory governments are actually cracking down, where they're testing you, they're challenging you to verify. And so on the next slide, we kind of talk a little bit about preparing that statement, right? As an example, because compliance comes in really huge, especially in the supply chain. And when you are preparing a statement, you're looking at slavery or human trafficking, and you want to say, we do business with suppliers, we don't tolerate, trafficking, and we don't, just making that big, bold statement. But what facts do you have to make sure your suppliers are adhering to and complying with that, right? So look at your risk assessment. Verify, identify where your suppliers sourcing their raw materials. So one of the items is cotton, right? So cotton that's sourced from to make textiles, to make clothing, right? That's a source of material that is under a WRO, withhold release order, which withhold release order are items that actually get blocked and stopped at the border. And so it is a policy that you are guilty, you have to prove your innocence. And so you don't want to be caught into that situation, right? So make sure you have policies that are relating to in your terms, conditions, any agreements, any contracts, where you're helping to flow that down to your suppliers and your requirements, but also making sure that you have processes and policies that can check, right? What is your supplier doing? Verifying their steps, where are they getting their product from? Showing how you can actually effectively manage this, and making sure that human trafficking is actually not taking place. Understand where the regions are, where they're sourcing the material, training your staff to understand and recognize about slave labor, forced labor, human trafficking, and those different types of areas of what that you can do before you actually start making statements in policies, right? So on the next slide, we talk about ESG, right? What it actually leads to from a commercial benefits, right? Reducing regulatory and compliance risk. Number one, especially in building supply chain resilience, improving your relationship with your suppliers, improving your corporate culture, right? Meeting customers on market expectations. A lot of customers are demanding now requirements for companies. They want to do business with companies who actually are, have ESG policies, that they're standing out. It becomes a competitive advantage. Decreasing operational disruptions, creating competitive advantage, right? And improving productivity and employee morale. How does it do that? Well, think about it from a perspective that you have activists, you have employees who are passionate about certain rights, certain requirements. And so they're proud to work for a company who stands strong on ethical issues, on strong values. And so there are many people that actually have voices, and you want to make sure that they're your audience, right? So in the next slide, we talk about an example where how it can actually reduce costs, right? So Nestle has actually announced that they are investing up to $2.1 billion by 2025, shifting from a virgin plastic packaging to food grade recycled plastic, right? So we all know the effects of plastic. We all understand where it ends up and what happens with it, but they're looking for ways to have sustainable packaging solution. So it's not only cutting down on our carbon footprint, right? But it's also it also helps them to operate and have stricter laws related to certain countries who have stricter use of packaging, plastics and packaging requirements, right? And on the next slide is an example of effective management. And this is Starbucks. So how many of you know that Starbucks has a China Parent Care program? This is really a cool program in that it is for aging elderly and employees of Starbucks in China, where they actually are providing healthcare coverage to your parents, right? And this was a huge move in a growing market. And the chairman of Starbucks said, supporting critical illness for aging parents exemplifies what we believe in our responsibility as a global public company and honors the family values deeply rooted in our Chinese culture. Can you imagine what this statement and this action made as a company as an impact on their employees? Huge motivational impact, huge motivational, I want to work for Starbucks. They are, that morale, what that it actually provides, right? So ESG is multiple things. And on the next slide, you'll see the 17 different sustainable development goals. This is what the UN, the United Nations, has actually created. And of these goals, they basically talk about no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, clean water and sanitation. You have clean energy, decent work and economic growth. You have industry, innovation, infrastructure, reducing inequality, diversity, right? Climate action, responsible consumption and production, life on land, life on the water, peace and justice, strong institutions, partnerships for goals, right? It sounds all social, also environmental, but compliance is a huge part of this in partnering with this to make sure, right? So on the next slide, here's where we can actually see the key elements where as compliance from a business view, customer's perspective, your competitor's perspective, and a regulator's perspective. All three have a significant impact, right? So just in the examples that we provided, we saw a customer's perspective. We also could see from a competitors' perspective, right? How they can take advantage and see this. In terms of, promoting their company, promoting things that they do, because it provides an advantage to the consumer, to customers. But also from a regulator's perspective, because we look at those regulations, what are cost-saving methods that we can do and still comply with the regulatory requirements. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit more about involving compliance, right? So ES&G does definitely need to involve compliance, because here's where, as compliance, we can provide auditing activities as part of your governance, as part of your requirements, your due diligence, that shows you made a statement, you're making these claims, these actions. What are you doing to provide that? Let's audit that and verify it. How are you controlling it? The reporting, the disclosures, those things that are required in different situations. So companies have to be accountable for their own activities at no matter what level, the board level, the executive level, all throughout your employees, but also your business partners, right? They're looking at anti-bribery, money laundering. Those are regulatory requirements. Compliance is huge on that, to audit that and finding that efficiency, finding the policies and procedures to ensure that we are complying with those laws. And then, of course, the forced labor for the import prohibitions. That's a huge supply chain risk right now, and big in the industry, that all eyes are on that right now. Reporting requirements. An example is RIPRA. That is a organization in Canada where they are looking at what's being thrown into their waste, their landfill, from tires, in the reporting requirements of that. They also have it for electronics. The Clean Air Act, we have different rules, laws within the state, each of the different states, certain products that cannot be sold in California because of the Clean Air Act, in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So they make, and so your products, depending on the chemicals, depending on how it's used and what it is, could be prohibited for being sold within those. All of these are environmental requirements, environmental laws from a regulatory perspective. So you have reporting obligations, you have traceability requirements for all types of goods. And so compliance is huge, right? For accountability, not only of board member activities from an ethical perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. And on the next slide, we kind of talk a little bit about things that you could actually consider, right? So things such as your code of conduct, right? How many people actually have a code of conduct policy, and what does it cover? What is it? How are you measuring the performance of those statements of what is actually addressed and written in there? So anti-bribery, anti-harassment, code of conduct. Do you have a supplier's code of conduct? Do you have expectations for your suppliers and how you expect them to behave? And can you audit them? Can you assure that this is what that they're doing, right? You have anti-bribery and money laundering. Providing any type of complete, trustworthy, and tamper-proof audit trail is very key, right? Customs logo, I've used it many times, is it's not what you say, it's what you can prove, right? Screening. Many companies, they've always used screening of restricted party persons, maybe their customers, their vendors. What about your banks? Do you know how long the arms are for Russian, and how that they are actually claiming tight holds into different banks? Your customer in Pakistan, your customer in India, any of your customers in other locations, how are they paying you? What does that bank have any arms, any ties back to Russian banks that are sanctioned? UBO screening, universal business owner. That gets into your OFAC sanctions. Who owns your company? Is it a government? Is it an actual individual entity? So make sure that you're screening all parties. And then use of contracts can help to mitigate the risk, right? Where you want to integrate some type of environmental, social, and governance due diligence principles, but it's not enough just to make a statement, right? You have to transfer those into a contractual obligation and set those expectations where you're building not only in your supply chain, but also within your employees, that monitoring, that reporting, that transparency, so that you can begin to audit that and provide proof. So on the next slide, I kind of provided you just kind of some examples when you're onboarding a vendor. When we kind of look at supply chain as an example, you want to know what is their product range. So you might be sourcing product from that specific vendor because you want one specific product, but what other product ranges do they source, right? So could be that maybe that the supplier makes a certain type of products, but they also sell products to the military. What military? The Chinese military, right? Which government entities, which military powers, right? So having an understanding of who your customer is, having do they actually manufacture their products, or are they a trader? Do they sell and do business in any of the US embargoed countries? Are they sourcing raw material? Where are they sourcing it from? Having those declarations, those audits, having an identification of standards, right? So if your supplier doesn't have any quality standards, any requirements with any type of a system, then how do you prove that the product and parts that you're buying are not counterfeit? There has to be a standardization. There has to be some type of testing, measuring of the equipment, of the processes, the products, performance requirements, especially if you're selling into any of the EU countries where they have a certificate of conformity. Identifying those standards helps you to know if the company even has any regulatory standards, right? Security controls, CTPAT, AEO, those regulatory requirements. Who do they allow into their facility? How are they controlling access to their facility? All of those have a requirement, right, within an organization. So on the next slide, we're talking a little bit more about supply chain still, but from an ES&G perspective, right? We're really, looking at those due diligent practices. We're looking at, what is it that companies are looking for? So conducting that risk assessment, looking at ensuring your suppliers have policies, that they have documented procedures, and have they been investigated in the past? So one way that we did is we actually had identified the high-risk countries for forced labor, for theft and terrorism, and those were considered high-risk countries. And so how much of our product are we sourcing from vendors located within those countries, where we set a certain amount of standards and guidelines that we actually are implementing and executing for those vendors to make sure that they have clear policies and procedures regarding the products that we're actually sourcing and buying from them, right? Because if you think about it, it's really a liability to you as a company. It is a liability of who you source product from. I remember years ago, I had a case study for Nestle, and where they sourced their cocoa from in South Africa. And some of the other countries, I can't remember, I'm trying to think, I think it was Congo area. And so they actually were running across the border, and they were pulling in little kids into their factory to work in the factory and helping to produce cocoa to make the chocolate. Well, Nestle had no idea. That's where they got involved, and they said, no, we don't approve this. And so they got involved in the integrity and that contractual requirement, but just being boots on the ground, what's happening, auditing, verifying, validating, you're not using any kind of means of forced labor, right? So there is an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and they've actually established some guidelines in which that they can provide practical support and to enterprises, companies, organizations on implementing different types of due diligence recommendations and things like that across the supply chain. And I think I've provided that link here. So when you're first on the next slide, where you're doing that initial assessment, right, that initial scoping, again, looking at your regions, what are more prone to risk factors for you as a company from an ES&G, environmental, social, and governance perspective. that regulatory framework from a social and economic perspective, right? Product risks, where they might be traders, and they're not a manufacturer, or if they are a manufacturer, what types of chemical are they using? So TSCA has the restrictions for PIP 3.1 chemical that has a restriction from the perspective that's used today as an anti-flame retardant in electronics. So it seems critical, seems important, but guess what? That chemical is prohibited for use when importing goods into the United States, or any manufacturing within the United States as well. So they postponed the law to October of 2023, but it is a requirement, right? So we have to educate our supply chain. We have to help educate them to know you can't bring this chemical in. And then from a business perspective, right, we're looking at those risks specific to a business. So map out your company supply chain, map out your company operations, where's those products coming from, having that tiered approach where you're actually looking at how do your suppliers source their products, identifying those risks related, okay? And so really the OECD, on the next slide, you'll see this is the link that I've provided for you that kind of gives you some of that additional guidelines for companies. They do talk about human rights. They do talk about employee and industrial relations, environment, combating bribery and bribe solicitations, consumer interests and disclosures. So it is some additional information, resource information that helps work to build a better policies, right, for better lives. And that's a lot of what ESG is. So next slide, basically. So what are we as a business? What are we actually doing, right? What are we as a company doing to not only that vision for our employees, that vision for our customers, for us as a liability, right? Because today, Gen Z, right, is moving center stage to stop buying certain brands because of ethical or sustainability concerns. So it's huge. It matters. You can make the decision, you can make a ethical decision, and companies are watching. And we saw that with Russia and Ukraine crisis that happened. And that was the first that they actually started moving ethically super fast on a decision well before the government actually even started putting in regulatory laws and requirements. So it matters, right? And so I do, on the next slide, had some points I just also wanted to share just as kind of some industry highlights. If anyone did or did not have any other questions, I guess we take those at the end, Kat, just let me know. Just kind of some industry highlights, what's going on. There is still $40 billion in cargo container ships. It's still offshore. So as of Friday, there was 125 containers off the North American ports, which is down 16% from January of this year. But there's still 36% of those ships that are waiting are still off the West Coast. A lot of companies are coming into East Coast, into Southern Coast, trying to come up through Canada as well. So 64% of those are on the East Coast and Gulf ports, right? So it's that shift where they're trying to find any port that they can actually bring cargo into. South Korea, the truckers have gone on strike at the ports because of the surge of fuel prices. In India, owners of trailers that actually carry the containers, they went on strike. Biden signed into law the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. This is related to the FMC, the Federal Motor Carriers for containers, for the surging prices of containers that went from $4,000 to $30,000 per container from importing goods in from Asia. And the influx of what that we saw in pricing to try to regulate that as much as they can. So let's watch what that's going to do. And then, of course, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that went into law in June of last month. Customs has released some operational guidance to help companies. with that type of data and information. And then effective in April 9th, both Russia and Belarus were subject to column 2 duty rates that are listed in the harmonized tariffs. So they were removed from the most favored nation status, which basically is now resulting in higher tariffs. So I know in the United States, if your goods have a country of origin of Russia, you will be impacted with an additional 35% tariff, and Canada, I believe, is also 35% tariff as well. So that's what I have for now that I wanted to share with you. Anybody have any questions?
Hey, Lisa, I'm going to jump in here. Thank you so much for all that information. So helpful. While we're waiting for some Q&A questions, you mentioned Nestle and Starbucks.
Mhm.
Are there other companies that you think does compliance well, or that you would recommend, like someone to start monitoring or just keep an eye on them?
So there are a number of companies. So they are doing well from an ES&G perspective. I'm sure they're well for compliance as well.
Mhm.
But definitely, I can't think of any company names right off the top of my head, but yes, there are a number of companies out there that do ES&G. I think you could look at your oil companies, right? Especially because they've been hurt already in the past. Nobody's perfect, but certainly there's processes and things that they can actually continue to do better, right? Based on past experiences. BP Oil is a great example, right? Enron, and those other examples that had corporate fraud, right? So they, of course, were forced to incorporate ES&G processes.
Where should a company start in some kind of compliance if they're interested in starting this journey? Where would you recommend a company start?
So I would look at the sustainable development goals, and I would look at your current business policy procedures and what is it today that you're doing and what is the company's vision that they want to do. So based on those UN sustainable development goals, is there things already that you're doing, things that you can see as a company that you want to do, that you actually need? And then also a separate risk assessment from a supply chain perspective, right? Because of regulatory requirements. Look at what is your existing policies that you're already doing as a company. Maybe there are things that you're already in compliance with or adhering to, or different things that are happening, and there could be continuous improvement. So I always say start with a risk assessment and evaluation. What are we doing today and what do we want to do in the future? And I would use those goals. Mhm.
Excellent.
Everything starts with a goal.
Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I just want to thank everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for your participation today. We appreciate you being here, and thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Very good. Thank you so much.